Do not touch the king's lifeguard!
What if I told you a royal guard, known for his silent demeanor, suddenly shouted at tourists in front of Buckingham Palace? Sounds unbelievable, right? But it really happened in 2003. Stay with me, because this shocking moment will leave you stunned. It was a typical day at Buckingham Palace in 2003, with the usual crowd of tourists eager to witness the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. The majestic guards, dressed in their familiar red uniforms and towering bearskin hats, stood at their posts, as motionless as statues. To many, they were nothing more than a backdrop to their photos, part of the historic landscape of London. But in reality, these guards had one of the toughest jobs, standing still for hours, enduring the attention and sometimes the misbehavior of tourists. They were trained to remain expressionless, their eyes forward, their bodies stiff as they held the line. It was a job that required immense discipline. For most of the visitors, it was a fascinating sight, watching the stoic guards as they stood unmoving in their positions, while the tourists, oblivious to the protocol, snapped photos and made jokes. Many had heard the myth: a royal guard will never speak or react, no matter what you do. But on that particular day, one group of tourists would push that myth to the limit. A family of tourists, clearly excited to be at such a historic location, found themselves standing right in front of one of the royal guards. They were no more than a few feet away, their cameras clicking away, when one of them, believing it would be a harmless gesture, tapped the guard's shoulder to get his attention. It was a line that should never have been crossed. The guard, until that point, had remained entirely still, stoic as ever. But this was the tipping point. His jaw clenched, his body stiffened, and in an instant he broke his silence. "Step back!" he bellowed, his voice louder and more commanding than anyone had expected. The tourists froze. They had tested the guard's patience, and they had failed. The crowd surrounding them fell silent as they witnessed what no one could have predicted: the royal guard shouting at the tourists. For a moment, no one moved. The tourists, now taken aback, stumbled backward in shock, their smiles fading as quickly as they had appeared. The guard stood tall once more, the interruption over. He returned to his original stance, unmoved, as if the incident had never occurred. But the energy in the air had changed completely. The air around Buckingham Palace had always been filled with excitement, but that day there was something in the atmosphere that felt different. The tourists, who had moments before been enjoying the sights and sounds of one of London's most iconic landmarks, stood stunned, unsure of how to react to what had just transpired. But it wasn't just the tourists who were caught off guard. The entire crowd, a mix of visitors from all over the world, stood frozen, their eyes wide, their breath held. This was not part of the show. This was real, raw, and unfiltered. The Royal Guard, a figure so renowned for his stoic presence, had never before shown any sign of emotion in public. His reputation for remaining unmoved in the face of all manner of antics from curious onlookers was legendary. So, when he finally spoke up, his booming voice cutting through the hush of the crowd, it was like a thunderclap in a clear sky. "Step back!" he shouted again, the words clear and direct. The tourists, initially unsure of whether they had heard him correctly, now had no doubt. There was no mistaking the authority in his voice. The woman who had dared to tap his shoulder was the first to react. Her face flushed a deep shade of red as the realization hit her. She had not only disrespected the royal guard, but had also unknowingly disrupted the delicate balance of the palace's daily ritual. She apologized, but her words seemed to fall flat, swallowed up by the silence that had descended upon the scene. For a brief moment, the only sound that could be heard was the faint rustling of the guard's uniform as he adjusted his posture, returning to his former position. But the mood had shifted. The tourists were no longer in awe of the ceremonial display. They were now filled with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. How could something so simple, tapping a shoulder, turn into such a momentous event? The crowd, which had once been buzzing with excitement, now stood in a tense silence. Some visitors had taken a step back, realizing that this moment wasn't just an opportunity for a photo op. It was a reminder of the importance of respect, of the protocols that governed even the most routine of ceremonies. In the midst of it all, one young boy, perhaps no older than 10, looked up at his father with wide eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did he shout?" he asked, his innocence exposing the gravity of the situation. The father, looking just as puzzled as his son, shook his head, unsure of how to explain what had just happened. He had never imagined that a simple visit to the palace would turn into a lesson on respect and authority. But the tourists weren't the only ones affected by the incident. Nearby, a group of people had been quietly observing the scene. They had witnessed the outburst, and their expressions revealed a mix of shock, disbelief, and even amusement. To them, this wasn't just another tourist spectacle. It was a moment that transcended the usual display of British pomp and circumstance. As the tourists slowly began to disperse, there was an underlying tension in the air. Some whispered to each other, recounting the incident, while others stood in stunned silence, still processing what had just occurred. The royal guard, his face a mask of unwavering discipline, had not uttered another word. He remained at his post, as still and silent as ever. For those who had been there that day, it would be a memory that would stay with them forever. Not because they had seen something extraordinary, but because they had witnessed the power of authority in its purest form. The guard's actions had reminded them that respect wasn't just something to be earned. It was something that had to be given. And sometimes it took a sudden, unexpected outburst to teach that lesson. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension lifting as people moved on to explore other parts of the palace. But for a few, there was still a lingering question. What had really happened there? Was it simply a case of a misunderstanding, or was it something deeper, a reminder that, in the presence of such tradition, there was no room for disrespect? As the palace resumed its usual rhythm, the tourists went on with their visits, but the memory of that shout, the power in that single command, would stay with them, reminding them of the line that should never be crossed. After the tension had faded and the crowd had dispersed, most of the tourists probably thought little of the incident. To some, it might have just been a momentary blip in their experience, a strange occurrence that could be quickly forgotten. But as the minutes passed, something more profound started to settle over the onlookers. The realization of how a single, unexpected action had unveiled a deeper lesson about respect, boundaries, and personal responsibility. Standing at attention, the royal guard had returned to his usual stoic posture, his eyes focused ahead, completely unfazed by the incident. For him, it was just another day on duty. But for the tourists, especially those who had witnessed the outburst up close, the moment lingered long after the guard had resumed his silent vigilance. It wasn't about what the tourists had done wrong. It was about the unintended lesson they'd learned about respect and the importance of understanding boundaries. In that brief moment of shouting, the royal guard had not only asserted his authority, but had also sent an unspoken message to everyone around him. There were lines that should not be crossed. It wasn't just about the space between him and the tourists. It was about the understanding that, in some places, tradition, authority, and decorum held a value far beyond the fleeting desires of curiosity seekers. One of the most striking aspects of the entire ordeal was the instant shift in the atmosphere. Prior to the outburst, the tourists had treated the royal guard almost as if he were a living statue, part of the backdrop to their photos. They had taken liberties without even thinking, assuming that the guard would remain completely passive, as he had for countless others before them. But the royal guard had made it clear in no uncertain terms that there were boundaries in every setting, especially in places of historical significance. What had begun as an innocent moment, one where a family simply sought to get a better photo of the guard, had swiftly turned into a lesson on personal space and respect for the roles people play in society. The tourists had not expected a reaction, and that was the problem. In a world where people often expect instant gratification, where selfies and photos are often taken without a second thought to the people around them, the incident at Buckingham Palace served as a sudden reminder of the importance of boundaries. For many of the onlookers, the incident left them reflecting on their own actions. How often did they take the presence of others for granted? How often did they forget that those in authority positions, whether they were guards or simply workers, deserved the same level of respect that they themselves expected? The scene that had unfolded in front of Buckingham Palace wasn't just about the tourists learning a lesson. It was about everyone in the crowd being reminded of the basic principles of respect and the importance of understanding that no one was above the rules. As time passed, the story of what had happened spread. It wasn't long before the incident became the subject of conversation, both among those who had witnessed it and among those who had heard about it later. To many, it was a moment of pure drama. A royal guard, typically seen as immovable and silent, breaking his composure to address the tourists. But to others, it became something far more profound. A moment of reflection on how easily boundaries could be crossed and how important it was to respect the spaces of others. While the royal guard had quickly returned to his impassive state, the tourists, on the other hand, were left to process the consequences of their actions. A brief tap on the shoulder had disrupted the flow of the palace's carefully orchestrated ceremony. But beyond the immediate discomfort, it was clear that the tourists had learned something more significant that day. Respect is not always a given. It must be earned, understood, and practiced by everyone. As Buckingham Palace continued its usual routine, the lesson lingered in the air. Tourists, once eager to get as close as possible for a picture, now gave a wider berth to the guards. They realized that the moment they had been so quick to interrupt was, in reality, part of something much larger, an institution of history, tradition, and respect that transcended individual desires. What had seemed like a simple moment of frustration was, in fact, a reminder of the values that held such traditions together. And for those who had been there that day, the image of the royal guard standing firm, shouting at the tourists, would forever symbolize the importance of understanding when to stop, when to respect, and when to honor the roles that others play in the grander narrative of society. As the crowd of tourists slowly dispersed and the palace grounds returned to their normal rhythm, something remarkable happened in the aftermath of the royal guard's outburst. The shift in the atmosphere wasn't immediately noticeable, but if you paid close attention, you could feel the change, an unspoken sense of respect that seemed to fill the air. Visitors who had earlier been eager to snap photos now stood a little farther back. The usual laughter and chatter had quieted down. In the place of casual conversations, there was a sense of reflection even among the most enthusiastic sightseers. The tourists who had crossed the line were no longer laughing about the incident. Some had even apologized to the guard, realizing the gravity of their mistake. It wasn't just about the shouting, it was about the deeper understanding that they had violated an unspoken rule, a rule of respect for the uniform, the duty, and the history that the Royal Guard represented. For the first time, some of the visitors saw the Royal Guard not as a mere figure in a traditional uniform, but as a human being performing a crucial, highly disciplined job. The uniform was not just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of a responsibility much greater than anyone had initially realized. And in that brief moment of confrontation, the guard had reminded them of that responsibility. What's even more fascinating was how this moment of tension became a catalyst for a ripple effect. Tourists who might have previously approached the scene with a sense of entitlement now seemed to approach with hesitation. They were more mindful, more aware of their surroundings. It was as if the shouting had made them pause and think, what if they too were in the guard's shoes? How would they feel if people continuously disregarded the boundaries of their work and personal space? And then, of course, there were the onlookers, the ones who had witnessed the entire interaction from a safe distance. Some of them were quick to judge, but as the event settled, many of them too had experienced a shift in their thinking. In a way, it wasn't just the tourists who had learned a lesson. The entire crowd had witnessed a very public reminder of what it meant to respect authority and to acknowledge the importance of boundaries. The Royal Guard had not only asserted his power in the moment, but had also given everyone who watched a glimpse into the true nature of his role. He wasn't just a stoic figure standing in place. He was there to maintain the dignity of the palace, to uphold traditions that spanned centuries. After the guard resumed his posture, one could hear the sound of footsteps gradually returning to their usual rhythm. The energy of the space had shifted, but it wasn't just from the tourists who had witnessed the incident. It was from the respect that had permeated the area. The Royal Guard's brief outburst had planted the seeds for a new kind of awareness. It was no longer just about taking pictures or capturing the perfect moment. It was about understanding that some places and some people were deserving of a certain level of reverence. The tourists, in their initial excitement, had overlooked the deeper significance of the Royal Guard's presence. But as the moment passed and the crowd began to clear, they started to realize that what they had just witnessed was more than an unexpected outburst. It was a reminder of the larger picture, the history, the duty, and the dedication that lay behind every uniform and every act of service. Even those who hadn't directly interacted with the Royal Guard couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing them to see the Guard in a new light. The Royal Guard had not only silenced a disruption, he had sparked a deeper sense of understanding in everyone around him. The change was subtle, but significant. By the time the last of the tourists moved on to explore the rest of the palace grounds, there was a collective understanding that the Guard wasn't just a figure of tradition. He was a living, breathing representative of something far bigger. In a world where lines are often blurred and boundaries ignored, the Royal Guard had used his voice in that one moment to remind everyone present of their duty to respect one another's space, role, and authority. And so, as the day continued, there was a lingering sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson learned and for the reminder that some moments, however brief, hold the power to change how we view the world around us. As the tourists began to disperse, the once tense atmosphere started to settle. The Royal Guard's sharp words hung in the air, and though the incident had passed, its effects were far from over. What stood out the most was how the Guard himself handled the aftermath. His posture, unyielding and unwavering, showed no sign of the emotional storm that had just unfolded. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like nothing had changed. But in truth, there was something deeper at play. The Guard didn't speak again after his initial outburst. He didn't need to. His silence was a testament to something far more profound, his unspoken resolve to uphold the dignity of his post. In the face of disrespect, he had spoken his truth, but now, in his silent stance, he was showing everyone that words weren't always necessary. Sometimes the most powerful message is delivered without uttering a single word. What amazed those who had witnessed the entire event was that the Guard did not show any signs of frustration or anger after the confrontation. It was as if he had expected this behavior and knew, deep down, that his duty was far beyond this singular moment. He wasn't looking for apologies, nor was he interested in drawing further attention to himself. He simply resumed his role, standing as immovable as ever. This sense of inner strength, of quiet determination, was what left a lasting impression on the visitors. It was in the moments after the shouting incident that the Guard truly demonstrated the nature of his work. His ability to stay composed, to silently communicate the importance of his position, made it clear that his work wasn't about fighting or confrontation. It was about presence and purpose. His job required not only physical endurance, but also mental fortitude. He stood not just to be a symbol of tradition, but as a living embodiment of the values of respect, discipline, and duty. Visitors who had once been caught up in their own world, taking photos and chatting loudly, now stood in hushed awe. Even the most oblivious of tourists began to respect the boundaries the Guard had set. They had come to realize that his presence wasn't merely to be admired from a distance, but was meant to be respected. This wasn't just another attraction for their social media posts. This was a person, a professional, who had dedicated his life to serving in one of the most iconic institutions in the world. The quiet after the incident wasn't just filled with the absence of sound, it was filled with an understanding. The tourists who had previously stepped over the line now stood a bit further away, no longer acting with the same carefree attitude. They had learned in a very real way that their casual actions had consequences. And those consequences didn't come in the form of punishment. They came in the form of a subtle yet impactful shift in how they viewed authority and respect. But it wasn't just the tourists who were affected. The other members of the guard, standing in their positions, displayed a subtle, silent solidarity. It was as if they all knew that the one guard who had spoken up had done something extraordinary. He had not only defended his space, but had also, in a sense, defended their collective role as keepers of history and tradition. Their shared silence in that moment communicated a powerful message of unity, strength, and an unwavering commitment to the task at hand. And as the day went on, the tourists, many of whom had been shocked into silence, began to look at the guards in a different light. They no longer saw them as mere statues or performers for their entertainment. The guards became humanized in their eyes, people with dignity, responsibility, and a deep connection to the history they were representing. Though the incident was over, the ripple effects continued to reverberate. People didn't just walk away thinking, "Oh, I saw a Royal Guard shout today." Instead, they walked away with a newfound sense of respect for the roles others play in society. They learned in that moment that there are boundaries in life that shouldn't be crossed, and that sometimes it's the smallest actions, like standing firm or speaking out when necessary, that leave the biggest impact. The Royal Guard, with his quiet strength and powerful presence, had not only enforced his duty, but had also quietly changed the way everyone around him saw the world. And in doing so, he had demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful changes don't come from grand gestures, but from the way we hold ourselves in the face of disrespect and adversity. As the day continued, the tourists who had gathered at Buckingham Palace began to share the story of what had just unfolded. Some had been direct witnesses to the confrontation, while others heard the whispers of what had transpired. It spread quickly, like wildfire, and by the time people started to leave the area, there was a noticeable shift in the way they looked at the Royal Guard. The incident, though brief, had planted a seed in the minds of many, causing them to reflect on the importance of respect, dignity, and the roles we all play in society. What many didn't realize was that this seemingly small moment had a far-reaching impact. While the tourists had initially been frustrated with the guard's stern reaction, they now understood the deeper meaning behind it. They saw that the guard wasn't simply reacting out of anger, but out of a sense of duty and honor. His role was not to entertain them or be the subject of their photos. It was to maintain a tradition that had been in place for centuries. As word spread, people began to change their behavior around the Royal Guard. Where they once saw him as just another figure in a uniform, they now understood that his position carried with it a sense of purpose that transcended the moment. In the days that followed, many visitors would pause before stepping too close to the guards, knowing that their respect for the boundaries set by these dedicated individuals was a sign of their own maturity and understanding. The real impact of the incident, however, was not just in the behavior of the tourists. It was also reflected in how the guards themselves, as a collective, stood even taller. Their roles, which were already steeped in history, gained an added layer of meaning. The incident had reaffirmed the value of their work and their commitment to protecting both the physical and symbolic sanctity of the monarchy. The Royal Guard was no longer just a figurehead to be admired from afar. They were guardians of something greater, custodians of a history that deserved reverence. What was even more remarkable was the way the public began to see the larger implications of the Royal Guard's actions. They realized that the Guard's response was not just about enforcing boundaries, it was about defending the traditions that had shaped Britain and its culture. By standing firm, by shouting when necessary, he had reminded everyone of the importance of preserving the past while looking forward to the future. His actions spoke not only to the tourists at Buckingham Palace, but to everyone who had ever questioned the value of upholding tradition in an ever-changing world. As the days passed, social media began to buzz with posts about the incident. Some mocked the tourists who had been scolded, while others praised the Royal Guard for his professionalism and poise under pressure. The story began to spread beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, becoming a topic of conversation in homes, offices, and cafes. People from all walks of life found themselves discussing the event, and in doing so, they started to reflect on their own behavior and the need for respect in everyday interactions. The incident at Buckingham Palace had become more than just a momentary clash between authority and tourists. It had sparked a broader conversation about respect, boundaries, and the significance of tradition in a modern world. It reminded people that no matter where they came from or what their background was, there were certain values that transcended time and place. And in that moment, the Royal Guard had become a symbol not just of discipline, but of the timeless principles that connect us all as human beings. What started as a seemingly minor confrontation at Buckingham Palace turned into a powerful reminder of the values that hold society together. The Royal Guard's quiet strength, his unwavering commitment to duty, and his refusal to back down in the face of disrespect left an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. Do you believe that respect is something that should never be taken for granted? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this story if it reminded you of the importance of tradition and dignity in our everyday lives.